It's really great to be here. And this is such a wonderful, cozy setting. And so I'm not going to say anything, I hope, that will agitate people, since they're blocking my primary form of egress from the room. So as Kyle indicated, the subject of my talk is civility and existential threats thereto. The title of the talk is Civility Dead? So let's begin with the definition. What is civility? Civility is, as I define it, and this is not just an outlandish idiosyncratic definition, but I think it's a fairly common one. Civility is a baseline of respect that we owe one another in public life. You can think of it as kind of a threshold of good manners that steer us away from the most overt forms of rudeness. There are other forms of good behavior, appropriate behavior, which can be more complex and sophisticated, but civility is the baseline. And many people have said, that we're living in the midst of a crisis in civility. And many of these same people who've said that would date the beginning of this crisis to the 2016 presidential election. And you certainly can find many examples from the election and since where you could say some norm of appropriate public behavior has been violated. One of my favorite examples from the election itself was during the Republican primaries when Marco Rubio made fun of the small size of then candidate Trump's hands. And this led to, during an actual presidential debate, them exchanging accusations about who had the stature to lead, and the formation of a political action committee called Release the Measurements. I don't know if it's true. The Washington Post followed up with shoe leather investigative reporting and dug up, believe it or not, an imprint of Donald Trump's hands, which they sent to a physiologist to determine whether they were unusually small. So you see that kind of thing happening, these schoolyard taunts during a presidential campaign, and since. You see a lot of people lament the passing of civility. The first thing I want to note today is just because you see a violation of norms of appropriate behavior or thresholds of respect in public life does not mean there's a crisis in civility. Our politics often feature what you could call strategic violations of norms of civility for the sake of personal advancement. When you think about it, this kind of action is not causing a crisis in civility. It's actually counting on a consensus on civil norms. It's only because there is a consensus on civil norms that the outrageous behavior attracts attention. So the provocateur is not abandoning or destroying civility, but counting on the existence of civility so that this person's tactical violation will generate an avalanche of publicity that the person can then use to redirect to objects of their interest. So that's important qualification to begin with, is that there is such a thing as strategic or tactical incivility, and one should be aware of it. But even granting that, there are lots of people who think we have a crisis of civility today. In fact, talk of crisis civility predated the current administration, predated the 2016 presidential election, has been with us in one form or another for recent decades. And the complaints here are manifold. They're not limited to presidential politics. It's that our media sensationalizes conflict and relentlessly stokes animosities. You see this in game frame coverage of public affairs. Who's up? Who's down? Who's winning? Who's losing? There can be a winner, but there has to be a loser, right? Digital platforms are teeming with insult and invective. If you ever spent any time in the comment section of Syracuse.com, right? It's just... You know what I'm talking about. Of course, it's not the only place where you see that. And in the workplace as well. I mean, any place that is public, we have seen concerns that there has been a rise in incivility, in boorish behavior. And this does look like a crisis when you sort of pull out and expand your scope. And people who share this idea that there is a crisis also often share not only a diagnosis, but their recommendation for a response. And that is a return to traditional courtesies. The idea that there was once in the United States a settled, practiced version of civility, that if we manage to recover that settled practice of traditional civility, we wouldn't find that we suddenly all agree, but we'd find that our disagreements are more peaceful and restrained. We'd find that our debates are more reasoned. We'd find that compromise is possible. We find that life online and offline is more sociable. So this conventional call to restore civility appeals to many people. but it runs into problems. And so my argument today, and it's an argument I make in a book called How Civility Works, is that this conventional call for return to traditional civility fails. And it fails in a couple of different ways. What I want to do today is describe to you the ways in which that conventional case is wrong and how it's also wrong about the nature of the crisis that we currently face. That's not to say that civility doesn't have its problems, isn't subject to criticism and has its weaknesses. But what I will argue is that the very features that make civility weak and undesirable also explain why civility is powerful and appealing. Its strengths are in its weaknesses. So what are the problems that I see with the conventional case for returning to traditional civility? There are two. First, it's not clear that civility is possible in the first place. It's true today, right, that we look at political polarization, its rise, or all sorts of metrics that show that it's very high right now, and the rise of the internet as maybe proximate reasons why we have a decline in adhering to norms of basic respect. But it's also the case that every generation of Americans has complained about deterioration of public conduct, and they have had no trouble identifying causes in their own time. In the 20th century, Americans blamed, in rough order, immigration, jazz music, World War I, Great Depression, World War II, rock and roll, Vietnam War, large-scale entry of women into the workforce, fast food. All these things have been blamed for decline in civility. In the 19th century, immigration also was blamed. The rise of the cities, Civil War, the vulgar rich, the insolent poor, they were all blamed. At the time of the ratification of our Constitution, that was a time of social crisis. The people who became the framers were very concerned that an established ethic of disinterestedness in public life was actually no longer established or adhered to, and that the crass, grasping politics in the states represented a return to barbarism. So we have had in the United States, literally in every generation, complaints about the death of civility. Given this long history of rudeness, what makes us think that civility is possible now? That's a question that anyone who wants a return to civility has to answer. Second question, even if civility is possible, is it desirable? Proponents of civility present our current public life as obviously dysfunctional, but perhaps it's less of a failure than an accomplishment. You can look at our public culture and you could celebrate it as a triumph of free speech society. Robust, uninhibited, wide-open debate allows for a competition of ideas. A competition of ideas itself allows us to learn new truths through this robust, wide-open debate. And even if we already have established truths, it allows us to have a more vital grasp on those truths we already know to be sound. Rather than seeking some more genteel mode of relating to one another that would deny the benefits of this free expression, this free speech culture, why not just tell people to speak their minds and have a thick skin? So, these are questions we must answer. Is civility possible? And if civility is possible, is it desirable? In answering these two questions, which I will do in relatively short order, you will be amazed at how quickly I answer these questions. You'll see that the weaknesses of civility, as I indicated, are real, but so too are its strengths, and that paradoxically, its strengths depend on its weaknesses. We will also encounter, for those of you who stick around, and there's more pizza, a third bonus problem. I will identify a third bonus problem with the return to civility. And I will answer the question that's at the heart of this bonus problem. And again, you will see that my answer will show that civility's strengths are in its weaknesses. So question number one, is civility possible given our long history of rudeness? When you look back, you can find many manuals on civility. I mean, many manuals on civility. George Washington, as a teenager, copied one out. He copied out 101, or actually 110, rules of civility. P.M. Forney, who was a professor at Johns Hopkins who ran the Civility Project, recently passed away. He said there were actually 25 rules of civility. Emily Post, who published her Etiquette in the middle of the 20th century, even though she passed away some time ago, Emily Post Institute continues to crank out editions. The 19th edition came out last year. Dozens and dozens of rules of appropriate behavior. Lynn Truss, English journalist and public intellectual, wrote a book called Talk to the Hand. She said there's only one rule of civility, and that is that other people exist, show some consideration. So we have a variety of different lists of rules of civility. There's, in fact, a welter of different manuals and lists of rules of what civility is, and in this sense, civility is unlike law. Law and civility are both sets of rules in a way, right? Sets of rules that seek to control individual behavior. But law is a system of rules also. Civility is merely a set. And what do I mean by that? In the case of law, we have these regulative institutions that tell us how to make new law, that tell us what the law is, to tell us what to do when we disagree about the meaning of the law. We have courts, we have legislatures, right, that officially tell us what the law is. Civility is quite different. It lacks that entire layer of regulative institutions. Civility is first taught to each of us, or a version of it, at home. And in a dynamic, diverse, heterogeneous society, we all learn it in slightly different ways. So you can learn different principles. And even more troublingly, if we have the same principles, we do not have shared agreement on how to apply them in concrete situations. So civility does have mechanisms of enforcement, it is true. Judith Martin, who you may know as the syndicated columnist who writes under the name of Miss Manners, says that she has a look of disapproval that can sizzle bacon. Right. So you can admonish people for violating what you take to be the norms of appropriate behavior, but that does not lead us to consensus. Because I'll accept that admonishment as valid only if I also accept your understanding of what is required as appropriate behavior in a given situation. So I might react to your admonishment by shrugging my shoulders and continuing on as I was, or maybe with anger. You will react to the experience by thinking that civility is under existential threat. So it's a curious nature of the crisis that we're in. The crisis in civility is always somebody else's fault. We all think that bad manners are ubiquitous, but none of us think that we ourselves have them. There is a civility survey that is done every year. It's called Civility in America survey. And last time it came out, they asked people, well, how often are you civil? And people said virtually 100% of the time. Okay, it was in the high 90s. And they said, how often are other people civil? Low 20s. Right? So I was driving here to work, 481, right? All these jerks on the freeway, right? They're there every morning. How can that be? The surveys have been done in the workplace, and you find virtually 100% people experience workplace interactions as lacking civility. But when these researchers, two business school professors, tracked down in these studies some people who were pegged as those engaging in uncivil behavior, frequently totally unaware that they had been rude. Civility, the sense that it's missing, doesn't occur because of civility's absence, it's because of its excess. The idea that civility is under an existential threat is not because civility isn't flourishing and growing out in many different directions, it's that it's decentralized and uncoordinated. Society-wide, we have no set of institutions to tell us what counts as civility. Now, I'm not suggesting that there be some. Some governments have tried. China has, in the run-up to the last Olympics, attempted to institute some norms of public behavior through exercise of centralized authority. You can try. That's not the way we do it here. So we often have competing civilities, and they clash. In fact, many important political conflicts in the United States have, as part of them, if not at their very core, a dispute over what counts as civil behavior. Consider just one example, and there are many, the civil rights movement in the middle of the 20th century. We celebrate that movement and document that movement in terms of legislative achievements, in terms of important court decisions. But it was also about a struggle over civility. Jim Crow segregation was surrounded and sustained by a form of racial etiquette that, when complied with, enacted and promoted racial hierarchy. What it meant to be a decent African American under those rules was to accede to and support racial hierarchy. Civil rights activists were not presenting themselves as destroying all civility. They, on the contrary, were advocating a new form of civility, much more egalitarian in nature. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote about this in a letter from a Birmingham jail. He documented what the racial etiquette was and insisted that the treatment from this point forward be different for everyone. At that political conflict, a piece of it, not all of it, but central to it, was a clash between competing conceptions of appropriate public behavior. From the perspective of the existing racial etiquette and Jim Crow segregation, what Martin Luther King and other civil rights activists were doing was incredibly uncivil. It was a violation of norms. It was destructive. It was barbaric. It could only be explained by outside agitators coming in and trying to wreck social norms. But from the perspective of the civil rights activists and their allies, it was an effort to overturn a hierarchy sustained by a set of manners. So, is civility possible? Yes, it's all too possible. We have many different versions of it. We don't agree on a single understanding of civility, and we may feel that that means that social order is under threat, but what it should really tell you is that to the extent we're able to share a sensibility, it emerges through conflict, not independent of it. We live in a world today that is the result of the civil rights struggle. We are witnessing now, and we can talk about it during Q&A, an effort to undo that through criticisms of political correctness. Right. So civility is something that we have many different forms of it, and they often can rise to the level of historic clashes, and we've seen it many times before. So civility is possible, all too possible. Is it really a problem that we can't agree on it? Even if civility is possible, is it a problem that we haven't arrived at a given consensus? Should we worry that there's clashes over civility? Should we worry that we have this feeling of existential threat in a context of excess of civility? John Stuart Mill, in his influential essay on liberty, he certainly was a critic of civility, right? He said, look how free speech works, right? I already referred to it at the top of the talk. It helps us identify truth. It gives us a more vital grasp on those truths we already know to be valid. But he said civility is not necessary for this free exchange of ideas. In fact, it's not only not necessary, it can be detrimental. Because rules of temperate speech can be used to paint nonconformists and dissenters as bad and immoral. It's a way of silencing speech. It can be a way of protecting a status quo by repressing dissent. So civility could be a form of policing, right? So you could say, oh, we don't have an agreement on civility, and some people say, I never want an agreement on civility because I want freedom. You'll see criticisms of protesters. This happens all the time. It happened probably nationwide with the Black Lives Matter movement. I think I even saw instances of it on this campus last semester, where you have disruptive behavior and someone will inevitably respond and say, you'd be more effective if you just lowered your voice. Now that redirects attention from the injustice that the protester is agitating about, and redirects the problem and relocates it in the style of complaint. This is called tone policing. It's a way of using norms of civility to shut down dissent. So civility is at best unnecessary for us to get the benefits of free speech, and at worst repressive. Who needs it? The answer is critics of civility. In every instance, people who are criticizing civility are not doing so for the sake of ending civility, but for inaugurating a new form that they prefer. So consider what it takes to participate in a free speech society and be effective. And we can go back to Aristotle for this, right? The elements of persuasive speech. Logical argument, that's a piece of it, it's not all of it. Targeted emotional appeal, so you can understand where the passions of your audience are and enlist them in supporting your argument. And representations of your own integrity, representations of your own decency. Now, the competition in free speech society involves rejecting ideas, involves rejecting arguments. And it can really sting when your argument is rejected, not because people spot a logical flaw or because you irritate people, but because you present yourself as morally deficient. This is where civility is of assistance to even the most avid advocate of free speech. Now, I know what you're thinking. Here we are. It's almost 1 o'clock, and I haven't mentioned Erasmus. The time has come, right? You're all certainly aware of Erasmus' blockbuster book on civility in the 1500s, a genuine bestseller on manners for children. Many, many, many editions, originally written in Latin, translated into every language since. And Erasmus says this is what civility does. It is a way of projecting or communicating outward honesty. It's a simple, easily administrable way of broadcasting your decency, right? Now, do you know that I'm a good person? Right? If you hung out with me, we went on joint vacations together, you might find I'm a good person. Maybe, hopefully, right? But how can you communicate to that people in settings where you may not encounter that person ever again? Civility, norms of appropriate behavior are a way of showing that. Good manners communicate our goodness. The very same advocates of free speech who criticize the repressive tendencies of civility are not seeking to dispense with civility altogether. They're seeking to revise civility so that dissenters are given access to its means of conveying good character, even as dissenters continue to voice unpopular positions. Mill, at the end of On Liberty, calls for a new form of civility that will give merited honor to all, regardless of their point of view. He doesn't want people to be stigmatized because they're dissenting. It doesn't mean you're an immoral person because you disagree with the majority. He wants to create a sense of civility that would allow such a person to present themselves as being a good and decent individual. We see this in the protests on campus. They're not seeking to run campus on the basis of sit-ins. They're seeking to run campus on the basis of norms of appropriate behavior that allow us to talk about inclusion, diversity, and difference, and not have that be a conversation that's inappropriate or somehow makes you antithetical to the mission or values of the university. Who's ready for a bonus question? Bonus? Yeah. Okay. Kathy wants a bonus question. So civility is valuable as a means of communication. That's why it's desirable. Yet it has signals that can be easily faked. Even Erasmus had his critics. People read On Manners for Children and they said, you know, what you're doing is you're presenting a manual here that allows people to publicize virtues they do not possess. You can act as a counterfeit. Civility can actually be a mask. It's supposedly revealing your inward honesty, but instead it can be hiding your inward dishonesty. Advocates of civility have sometimes come right out and said this. Lord Chesterfield, who wrote a series of letters at the end of the 1700s to his illegitimate son, and he said, I have nothing to give you, but I can give you training in manners. Send these letters. These letters on the art of being a gentleman have been continuously in print ever since published after Chesterfield's death. Most recently published as an ebook, so you can lay your hands on them. Chesterfield said, quote, the well-bred gentleman, like the chameleon, must be able to take every different hue, end quote. The original definition of a con man, by the way, a term that was coined in the 19th century, is a swindler of genteel appearance. What is the crime of the con artist? The con artist robs us of the belief that only good people have good manners. I could go on in this vein. I'll stop because the point is that manners and civility can be hypocritically manipulated. There are many instances where people denouncing the conventions of appropriate behavior are really complaining about the artifice, the inauthenticity, right? I'm not telling you who I am, I'm just being nice, right? That people will, even if you accept that civility is possible, that we're trying forms of civility all the time. Even if you believe that civility is desirable, you might reject it on the grounds that it's hypocritical. It turns us all into hypocrites. So what do we say about that? Well, imagine a society filled with people who have high ideals, who have a sense of moral purpose and moral order that gives direction to their lives. But imagine that these same people are filled with low passions in addition to their high principles. And the two are inextricably bound. They are filled with vanity, ambition, self-interest, and these low passions prevent them from practicing the high principles that they preach. In such a society, norms of behavior, norms of appropriate behavior, can allow you to appear to be good and decent without requiring very much in the way of actual virtue. Civility enlists your desire to present a good face, enlists the powerful desire, social desire, to appear to be a good and decent person, harnesses it in a way that allows us to behave better than we otherwise would. So if you've been imagining that society, you can cease imagining and look around. That society is the one we live in, right? This is a society we've always lived in, a society where we have moral ideals, but we have these low passions that prevent us from consistently realizing them. And in that society, the inauthenticity of civil behavior is at once deplorable, but also necessary to secure social peace. So let me conclude. Is civility dead? Well, there are reasons for concern, right? There's a broad sense going beyond recent years, recent elections, of an existential crisis in civility. Many people worry that it's entirely absent. Other people complain that civility is necessarily repressive. It squelches free speech and can sustain status quo hierarchies. And still others decry civility for its artificial and inauthentic incentives that provides for that kind of behavior. These last two criticisms of civility, that it's repressive and that it promotes or allows and facilitates hypocritical manipulation, if those are true, and they are true, but if that's all there is to the truth, then we shouldn't ask, is civility dead? We should ask, how can we kill it, right? But there's more to the picture than those criticisms, which are real. We experience the absence of civility, yes, but we do so in the context of its excess. We see civility as an impediment to free speech and to liberty, but it's also a means of communication that underwrites free speech and free exchange of ideas. We see civility as a bulwark of status quo privilege and hierarchy, but we also see social movements enlisting claims of new appropriate behavior all the time as a means of leveling social relations. We decry the inauthenticity and artificiality of civility, yet we rely on the hypocritical behavior that civility affords. It's paradoxical, and these paradoxes explain how civility works at a bookstore near you. How Civility Works, that's the title of the book, right? So they tell us that even though the weaknesses of civility are real, these weaknesses are not a cause to give up, they are a call to join in. If history shows us anything besides repeated complaints about the death of civility, is that what counts as some rough consensus about civil norms is determined through conflict. Civility is not a set of standards that exists outside of our politics. Civility is a set of standards that are determined through our politics. So what does that mean for us? Each of us should advocate for the kind of civility we want and model it in our speech and actions every time we are in public, which includes when we sit down to eat. In our diverse and dynamic society, there's not really a hope that we will have one final view of civility that will settle on for all time. But if you are an advocate of more egalitarian civility, as am I, then by modeling that civility in your life, you can at least help prevent inegalitarian and hierarchical versions of civility from gaining ground. It's our responsibility to fashion a civility that is fit for a free and equal people. It is our opportunity to create the kind of civility that we desire. So thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions.